So we're back with another video. This next series is going to be on Karl Marx and Friedrich Engles, and then John Stuart Mill. Let's get to it. So again, my past experience from the semester of spring 20 was that I spent way too much time on these, making too long of videos. So there's a lot of background. So I highly recommend you guys using even Wikipedia, but probably a better resource would be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. That might be helpful. But here's our paper prompt for paper 4. According to On Liberty, why is tyranny of the majority worse than tyranny of the government? Explain your answers using the relevant text as evidence. What in the Marx reading, if anything, would give Mill concern given his worry about the tyranny of the majority? Yes or no, does Marx provide any justification for a working class revolution that Mill could possibly find acceptable? So this is one of my contributions to the course. I kind of modified this. I don't think there was a paper originally with these readings, but they actually do speak to each other well. And both Mill and Marx are going to be building off of all the contract theories that we just completed. Mill is giving us maybe a more nuanced understanding of liberalism, and Marx is kind of taking the insights again of, say, republicanism, and then moving beyond the liberal or even the Republican idea of, say, having private property. That is explicit in the reading you did for Rousseau, so hopefully you did it. Hopefully I make note of that in our class, that you should pay attention to where Rousseau is talking about property. And so here I have some background from last semester, just some other ththings. So we have here where Mill's talking about the social contract. So again, a key term we should know that I assume we all know now. You can still ask questions, but that's just I'm just building my teaching style on the assumption that you have comprehended these kind of key aspects. If you haven't, there's no shame in that. Ask me about it. But the establishment of constitutional checks by which the consent of the community or the body of some sort supposed to represent its interest was made a necessary condition to some of the more important acts of the governing power. So again, here Mill's hearkening back to the things we just read, where again, this idea of legitimacy, freedom of choice, freely choosing, not forcing people to follow your will, like maybe in the Machiavelli, seems to be this kind of like really important development in human history, at least if you like some of the values that are expressed in the United States. So if you're kind of in a country, if you're the kind of person who thinks America could do better, you're basically arguing from these principles, but you're saying America doesn't fulfill them enough, surprisingly enough. Although if you're a Marxist or a communist, you might disagree. The idea of coercive power, so we talked about that. And then this idea of the classical liberal, this kind of Lockean liberals, priority of private autonomy, so individual freedom over that of society. And there's a clip from HBO's John Adams talking about that. And then this idea of this Rousseauian republicanism, or the priority of the public autonomy or the collective freedom over that of the individual. So there's that famous line in our notes from set 3 of the community can force you to be free. So this is this kind of constant struggle we have in countries like the United States. Other countries like, say, Australia and Brazil can force you to be free when it comes to voting. The only time we really do that in the United States is, like, say, with jury duty, things like that. So are you really free if you're forced to do something? And this is this kind of communist, Republican kind of logic from the show Chernobyl about self-sacrifice. So another quote from Mill, potential reply to this kind of Republican thought is, there is a limit to the legitimate interference of collective opinion with individual independence. And to find that limit and maintain it against encroachment is as indispensable to a good condition to human affairs as protection against political despotism from the government. Right? And that's from On Liberty, page 9 for me. On Liberty is like a critically important book. It's really good stuff. So now we get to the Communist Manifesto properly. So here we have a picture of Karl Marx. Here we have a picture of Friedrich Engles. So again, like Engles, historically, if you're ever interested in this stuff, maybe doesn't get as much credit as he ought to. He kind of wrote in Marx's name, oftentimes responding to things, but he kind of like was the financial support for Marx. But they both had like these important contributions to this kind of school of thought. And then here, if you don't know, if you're not familiar, is the kind of communist symbol that was adopted. This is the sickle. It's an agricultural implement to cut wheat, and a hammer. This is a tool used in, say, metal fabrication and things like that. So it's supposed to symbolize the unification of different kinds of worker. Urban industrial workers and rural farm workers, right? So again, it's the idea of the worker or the working class. I never knew that. It was well into my adulthood when I was like, oh, now I see it. But now that I see it, I can't unsee it. I just thought it was a cool symbol from Rocky IV. So there's a lot of key terms, and I'm going to do a brief overview right now. But some of these things to pay attention to in the reading are class struggle, historical materialism, stages of history, means of production, the bourgeois or the owners or bourgeoisie. Again, I'm not a good French speaker here. And then proletariat, meaning the worker or the working class. The owners or the workers, the haves and the have-nots. And so what's the kind of framework, like I did with the other previous readings, that you should come into this? The Communist Manifesto is kind of like it's a manifesto to motivate revolution. So in some ways, you might see it as being comparable to the Declaration of Independence. And so there is similarities in that thought. Marx is kind of doing this peculiar historical analysis. So one thing to keep in mind too is that though you may find Marx's arguments convincing, and many people do, and there are still communist countries like, say, China, it's not actually scientific and it's not actually historical. He's reading into history. I think this, don't quote me on this, I think this is what people mean when they say historicism, where you're kind of reading into history. I'm not sure. This is out of my range of things that I'm comfortable talking about. Usually if I don't understand it, I think it's stupid. And that's not necessarily a good way to be. So he's analyzing these histories, he's trying to understand human nature, so in this kind of Machiavellian sense, perhaps, human psychology. And he kind of determines that there's just kind of like human stages of development. And the way you can tell is by the means of production at the time. So the means of production means the way in which you make things. Are you a hunter-gatherer to get food? Are you an agricultural society where you farm? Do you have slaves making goods for you, like in other times of history? Do you have kind of capitalistic infrastructure where you have machines making machines? And so that's what he means by when he says the means of production. And so when he says ownership or the bourgeois, these are the people that own the means of production. So most of us probably, unless we have our own small company, don't own the means of production. What Marx is talking about is like the people who own ExxonMobil, the oil company, people who own Walmart, the Walton family, people that own different kind of automakers, right? They own all the machines that make the cars in some sense. And so before they sell them, they own all those cars. And so this is this kind of big capitalism that he finds to be this other kind of word, alienating, where, again, you're starting to see maybe, if you're very familiar with this kind of social justice logic, they're borrowing a lot of this stuff from Marx, and then subsequent thinkers in, say, the 50s and 60s had a different interpretation predicated on, say, identity as opposed to, say, class. But the point is, like, there's like this kind of system or systemic creation that essentially oppresses people. And so people would not agree in a social contract sense to be oppressed, as the other three contract theorists were discussing. So then Marx is saying, like, in maybe the Lockean sense, this justifies a workers' revolution, or a people's. So again, when the communists talk about the people, they mean the workers. They just don't tend to represent the people in practice. That's neither here nor there. I did that a lot last semester. I went off on why I don't think communism is the best theory, but that's not really fair. And again, if you're a communist, I've had communist friends. I'm willing to entertain the debate. So again, this kind of diagnosis of history, and then, but all these systems kind of build upon themselves. Other key terms you can look into are synthesis, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis is a very German way of building a philosophical argument. It comes from Hegel. Marx is actually in the Hegelian camp, this other famous philosopher that came before him. And so what Marx is basically saying is that the material conditions of the world drive history forward. This is kind of his insight or his perspective. It's not necessarily true. And his perspective basically says that, you can't have a revolution unless people are sufficiently motivated to, say, have one. And that's not going to happen unless the conditions are such that motivate people to behave a certain way. So he's taking the priority of material, like in the Hobbesian sense, over, say, ideas in other thinkers' types of ideas. So again, you don't have the idea of revolution. Nothing will come of it if you stand on the street corner with a sign, let's revolt. People have to have skin in the game before they do that, and that's arguable. So yeah, I think I spent more time kind of doing background than I thought, but it's important to kind of take note, again, this idea of class struggle, that one class historically has always tried to oppress the other. It has changed in context depending on the means of production. So in the beginning, there was hunter and gatherers, and then essentially barbarians came and conquered them. So then you had the conquerors versus the conquered, right? So it's like, then you had to a new society where you accumulate wealth, maybe, and then you have, well, I'm going to have slaves, and they're the oppressed, and I'm the oppressor, right? That they do all the work, and then the small minority of people benefit. And then that kind of progresses into, say, mercantilism and imperialism, colonialism, or even before that, maybe serfs and kings, and then that turns into colonialism. And then now we get into, say, these things, capitalism. And Marx thinks that these things all build on each other. You don't lose the insights or the benefits of the previous generations. You build upon them. And so actually Marx surprisingly did most of his work about capitalism. Das Kapital is 3 volumes. 2 of them came out when he was alive. And most of the best parts of Marx are actually criticisms of capitalism. He doesn't actually say really much what communism is, other than the objective of a communist society and a communist revolution is to move to a situation in which you do not have a state or a government. And to kind of skip ahead, spoiler alert, that's in order to eliminate private property. So as we talked about before, private property only exists because a structure, a system, if you guys like, this generation seems to like that kind of word, is behind a concept to make it real. There is no such thing as property in itself. It's a human construct. Nothing is yours other than might makes right. And again, we talked about how that instability led to the contract theorists. And now basically Marx is saying, like, okay, the contract theorists had their development, they had capitalism, those were good things, that they got bigger and more corrupt, and now they alienate, and now we can have this kind of revolution to get to this stateless situation in which there's no property and all these kind of other things. This is highly sophisticated. He motivated generations of people, not just scholars, but actual revolutionaries, also some of the worst people in the world. And so I cannot do it justice. This could be its own class. But it's important to kind of get the basics. I think I'm already running more time than I want. So let's start getting into some of these key quotations and again, thinking about them critically. So we have here Marx and Engles from the Communist Manifesto. We communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right to personally acquiring property as the fruits of man's own labor, which property is alleged to be the groundwork of all personal freedoms, right? This is what the liberals were talking about, and the Republicans in the previous readings. Activity and independence, hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned, and it's an exclamation point, so he's being sarcastic here. Again, this isn't the best written type of philosophical argument. It's meant to motivate. It's a call to revolution. So this is the kind of persuasive logic many of you were thinking about with the Machiavelli reading, which was what I wasn't particularly concerned with in that assignment. Do you mean property of the petty artisan and the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There is no need to abolish that. The development of industry has to great extent already destroyed it and is still destroying it daily. And so what he's saying is that this idea of property that people oftentimes attribute to communists even in the 1800s, the 1840s, is not what he's talking about. He's talking about this kind of private property of this big means of production, as I kind of said earlier, not my own necessarily personal property. So he thinks that can persist because it persisted in previous generations. So an example here, what he's talking about is that big business has already destroyed it. For much of American history, our economy and people's lives were comprised of an agrarian society, so people owning small farms. But as technology developed and there were tractors and better things, it no longer became sustainable to own and have a living from a small family farm. And so, and as we know, there have been less and less farmers. Now we have these big kind of farming businesses that do much of our agricultural stuff. And so we still have people who want to support small family businesses, but this is this kind of thing that Marx is talking about, because maybe you want to be a farmer. And so now these people who would otherwise be farmers are alienated. They cannot do this thing that they love to do because it's not even that it's not profitable. They can't even have a living doing it, if that makes sense. So that's what he's talking about. He's kind of he's already advancing here a counter argument, which he's overcoming. So on revolution here. In these crises, a great part not only of existing products, but also of the previously created productive force are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that, in all early epochs, would have seemed absurd: the epidemic of overproduction. So basically what he's saying here, again, this might be hard to follow if you haven't read it and you're just listening to me first. In every other period of human history, there was never enough stuff. And this kind of peculiar crisis occurs in capitalism with overproduction. There being too much stuff. So how is that? He basically thinks that if there's like a product, like say a cell phone, that you can't sell anymore. So imagine everyone has like the best cell phone that you can have. Apple makes the best cell phone. Uh, Samsung makes the best cell phone. There's no more improvements. All you're doing is making minimal improvements. So then everyone owns one, and then your profits go down and down and down. And so in order to keep profits up, you have to start firing people because the only thing you can really cut is cost, right? But the problem there is that now you have more and more people out of work. People don't have money to go get food, right? This is going to cause the material conditions to have a revolution, okay? We can talk more about this in class, I'm hoping. So that's what he sees like it's kind of this peculiar crisis that capitalism creates, is the crisis of overproduction. The first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to establish democracy. So, right, so the majority will, because most people are going to be workers, not owners. So again, like we talked about in the other article, in the other readings, the contract theory said this for this idea of say majority, maybe not democracy, but majority vote seemed to be the best way of solving disputes for both Locke and Rousseau. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeois, all kind of money and resources. Not just money, but like the actual property. To centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive force as rapidly as possible. So the idea here is that the people will essentially take all this kind of big capitalistic infrastructure, and instead of it being used to make the Ford family rich and the Walton family rich, right, to maximize profit for shareholders, the goods and services those firms produce will be used for the betterment of all of mankind. Again, it probably sounds partial. It just doesn't seem to work in practice, but that's the idea behind communism there. And then we have, I guess, the important kind of notes to go over. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be affected except by means of despotic inroads. So again, you can see my kind of worry, and these are the things that you should pay attention to when you are thinking about the mill. So you should, after you go read this, listen to the mill, read the mill, and go back and consider this stuff for your paper. So obviously this stuff, and this is again just Marx saying this, right? By inroads, by means of despotic inroads, being a despot on the rights of property, and on the condition of bourgeois production, by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which, in the course of the movement, outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. So again, you kind of have to. It's not going to be this kind of easy thing. People are not going to want to lose their property, and so you're going to have to be despotic. You're going to have to kind of take it. So then we get into these kind of questions about, well, is what Marx actually advocating for legitimate, maybe in this Western liberal sense? I mean, it's not. He's not trying to be. He's kind of making this higher moral claim of, oppression, and the only reason why you think it's illegitimate is because you're essentially brainwashed, which maybe you guys can ask me about, or we can talk about further. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only through the forcible overthrow. So obviously I've made these things for you guys to pay attention to, of all existing social conditions. So I'll come back to this and I'll end. Actually, maybe this video is going to be shorter than I thought. I'll end with this kind of observation. The overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling class tremble at the communist revolution. Again, this just doesn't strike me as like very parsimonious kind of language. Well, I guess parsimonious is the wrong word. Kind of peaceful language here. A communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. That's a very famous line from Marx. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. And that gets translated different ways now. Usually it's like workers of the world unite. It depends. So again, this is written I think in German, but Marx wrote in French. And I think some of his works was he worked at a New York newspaper in his life. So again, he was very much a public intellectual, which is kind of interesting. I mean, we have those now still too. Yeah, I don't think he taught it at school. Yeah, he wasn't. He was actually like I don't know what you'd call him, a professional activist, I guess you would call him, for his time period. He did not teach. He was not a professor anymore. Okay, so, and then it's YouTube clip, communist response to the Chernobyl disaster. Oh, and so this is again like the party in Chernobyl from this HBO miniseries about this disaster that happened in the 80s, this nuclear energy disaster, and how the actual Communist Party would actually operate in practice. And so again, we know, China's not much better in this regard currently. So how does Marx? So no philosopher wants to say their position is illegitimate. So what Marx is going to say is that the reason why people might take it aback to this kind of revolution that he's advocating for, right, in the same way that the Americans were justifying themselves in the Declaration of Independence, which I guess we will read or think about in the next set of readings, is that he's saying that culture is also part of this systemic kind of oppression. And so, again, this is something I think that's actually borrowed today pretty heavily, and oftentimes, depending on the public intellectual using it, in a either imprecise way or in a way in which, the common, soccer dad's not going to get. I struggle with it too. And so usually when people talk about the system, they kind of mean like the laws and policies that are implemented. So in the United States, slavery was a system of oppression, like literally, it was the law. And then after that, segregation. And then people talk about how, well, those things have echoes that can cause marginalization or oppression or discrimination, continuing on, go on and so forth. And then that gets conflated with this idea of systemic meaning everything. So again, I think if you know about some of these like kind of white privilege, white fragility arguments, they're not strong, but there might be truth to them, but they're not strong philosophical arguments because they rely on this kind of Marxist sense of like systemic. And so what I mean by that is it's essentially, it's ubiquitous, it's everything. And that doesn't seem to hold water because for Marx, not everything revolves around, say, economics. And then in these other kind of cases, not everything people do revolves around race, even though there are scholars of race that make that contention. So again, I don't want to bias you. People argue for these things, and you may be partial to them. But they're, again, we talked about with our Machiavelli readings, this kind of threshold of demonstrable proof or convincingness. Making these grandiose claims are very hard to prove, right? So they're not as convincing as they would otherwise be. And oftentimes, as with Marx, they rely on your personal experiences with things, which means it's much more about a passionate argument and not necessarily a reasonable or logical one, which again, there's other food for thought. So I think now we're kind of like this kind of more serious contemporary stuff. So hopefully I've talked about that sufficiently respectfully. So what does Marx mean by the system then is that, and this kind of oppression that you don't even understand. So this key term that Marx uses to say false consciousness. So he says that the reason why you're not agreeing to this revolution is one, you're either an owner, which means it's not in your interest, or two, you're just a worker who doesn't understand your place. And so part of that he thinks is that bourgeois society, the owners, have created culture to essentially blind you from the reality, right? So it's kind of like the Matrix, right? So it's again this ubiquitous kind of system. So again, I'm using system in a different way. It's not just the laws and the policies. And so the reason why you're not going to be partial to this kind of revolution is because part of this kind of culture is religion. And you realize if you take something against someone's will, you've stolen something, right? But Marx's point is why he's famously against religion. He says it's the opiate of the masses, is that that's just like a logic that stealing is going to make you go to hell or it's going to upset God. Because if you're stealing from a rich person, they're oppressing you. You're not doing anything wrong. And so you think that there's like an invisible man in the sky or is going to send you to hell. And they teach you that when you're little, and then you learn that. And then it's like, well, then now I'm not going to steal, not because I don't think it's right or wrong. It's because I don't want to get in trouble with God. And so that's what he means by essentially culture. It's religion. It's our values. It's, the moral of a story. It's all this, it's movies and books and all these different things that we read are kind of inundated with. And it shapes our thinking so that we erect this kind of false consciousness that we never actually appreciate that we're being oppressed. So I think I'll talk about that more. Please ask me questions about that. I don't want to, if I pontificate on that, I'm going to take forever. So then what motivates this kind of revolution, and then how do we get out of it or get into a better circumstance? Goes back to this kind of crisis of the overproduction. And so essentially as there are no more needs to create new jobs and pay people money, they can no longer have a living wage. And so they literally cannot go to the store because for Marx, they're this kind of wage slave. You only make enough money to live. That's the system is built only to kind of keep you in these chains, right? Just to be a worker. You can't really move, it's an illusion that you can move up or down, which again is contestable, but this is kind of the Marxist view. And so, like I said back with my Apple example, my phone example, on day one of as the crisis of overproduction hits the owners, they decide to fire one person, and then that person's, doesn't have any money, and they stand in front of their grocery store. And then, the next day they decide they have to fire two people because they're always trying to keep their profits up. Because that's the whole basis of the system. It's the whole point of living in that society. And then this continues, so on and so forth. And this doesn't happen just with, let's say, the phone industry. It happens with every industry. So basically, again, Marx relies on this assumption that, like, technology is not going to progress anymore. There's no more innovation, and everyone just has everything they need. So he's kind of envisioned like a Star Trek type of world. And as more and more people get fired, right, days are going by, and the first person hasn't eaten in a week, right, because they've been out of work for a week. And then this continues, and now there's 100 people, and they haven't eaten for 2 weeks. And there's, 5,000 people, and they haven't eaten for 3 weeks. Now there's 500,000 people, and they haven't eaten in a month, right? Because they don't have money to go into the store, right? They don't have the ability to have the social contract to have exchange of property, my money for their goods. And so when you think about a grocery store, it's this building, and in front of the grocery store it's just glass, so you can see into it, right? It's not like it's not a bank. And it's just glass, and there's these doors that open when you come into them. And so there's more and more people kind of get out in front of the grocery store. They put their security guard out there, but it's just a security guard. They don't have a gun or anything. And so I'm kind of hesitant. I don't want to steal. But eventually, as this kind of proletariat army, or the army of the people kind of forms, we realize, no, we can storm the gates of the castle. We can storm the Bastille, right? So again, there's a lot of influence here from the French Revolution. And we can just go take the stuff because we need to eat, because we want to live. And so that seems what's right. Like, human flourishing seems what's essentially morally correct, not the respecting of private property. And so this is what Marx is saying is once the state does not have the capacity to make private property real, so as soon as you go loot, there is no private property, it just might makes right. Then he says this is the revolution, this is what's going to cause it. When this happens everywhere at the same time, then you don't have a functioning liberal democratic capitalistic society anymore. And that's what he means by having this revolution, is just like taking over the stuff by force, right? So you're pushing the security guard out of the way. You're no longer respecting that norm of like not stealing stuff at all because you're so hungry, right? So that's again that material condition. Maybe when you're not hungry or you've already eaten all day, right? You're not going to go steal food. Why? I mean, people do that, but we think of them as like being degenerates. It's like you're a kleptomaniac. But and then we witness this when hurricanes or earthquakes happen, when the civil services break down. There's no police. People have evacuated. That we don't begrudge people when they break into a grocery store to steal, not even steal, right? To take baby formula for their babies or something like that. And so that kind of thing that we observe in real time and have is what Marx is talking about. So this is this kind of revolution. And once the state doesn't have the capacity, or the people take away the capacity for it to enforce private property, you essentially have a stateless society, right? That now people are essentially going to organize themselves democratically. And as we talked about, what we'll get to, again, I'm sure Yuki will have some good insights, that the anarchists have a very similar view about this, right? So anarchists and communists kind of had the same ending point. And then again, there's just these kind of different schools of thought about how you get there, what the end point's going to look like, but the end point's basically the same. This kind of stateless society, right? So why did I get rid of the state? Why did I overthrow that power, that coercive power? Because I wanted to get rid of private property. Why did I want to get rid of private property? Because I wanted to end the oppression of the people that owned the property, right? So I did that. I did this kind of process to obtain liberation, right? And to have a life that's not alienated. I get to have this free conscious activity, and everyone supports everyone. So again, it's very, very idealistic. It's very, very utopian. And then Marx himself doesn't actually tell us much about what a communist society would actually look like. And his successors did much more of that than he actually did. He just said, like, yeah, we want to move to this situation without capitalism, without private property. I don't know how long this is. I'm guessing it's going to be about a half hour, 35 minutes. So that's the Marx. You definitely have to read. You're not going to get away with not reading this one. So I'll see you guys in the next video, and hopefully you're ready for this paper.